seismic news coming out of Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, who has overseen effectively America's strategy in Ukraine and with regards to Russia for more than 10 years, you would argue, is stepping down, signaling, we can put this element up, signaling a likely strategic shift coming forward. If we could put up this second element here, this is a post on Twitter that was going around. I think not terribly unfair. The guy wrote, big news, likely signaling a major policy shift. Nuland has run point on our Russia-Europe policy ever since we helped engineer the Maidan coup d'etat. The results after 10 years are in. Ukraine is destroyed and has permanently lost Crimea and its main industrial region. Europe deindustrializing. Russia permanently alienated and tighter than ever with China, India, and Iran. Much of the world refused to isolate Russia and suffered no consequences. Institutions central to U.S. dollar hegemony, no longer viewed as neutral. Nord Stream, we're going to talk about this later when we get to the Houthis and the cables, the fiber optic cables. Nord Stream broke the seal on sabotaging international infrastructure. Russian military capabilities significantly increased, not decreased. Countries like Iran, North Korea, etc., have seen that short of total war, NATO conventional capabilities are quite limited. She writes, still, Nuland is one of those undead creatures in Washington who has only ever failed upward, so her resignation probably indicates her usefulness has finally run out. This is one of those posts where you look at it, you're like, no lies detected.
Basically. And, Ryan, I don't know if this was a Freudian slip, but I thought it was really funny when you opened this block. You said, big news out of Ukraine, when technically it really is big news out of Ukraine, though she is a U.S. diplomat. There's a quote here from Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who said, it's Victoria's leadership on Ukraine that diplomats and students of foreign policy will study for years to come. This is what he said in a written statement. No lies detected there either. Her efforts have been indispensable to confronting Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, marshaling a global coalition to ensure his strategic failure. Now, that's where the lies are sort of starting to be detected, but it's absolutely true that she will be studied for years to come. And I would also just add to this, Ryan, I think Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, Joe Biden himself, remember, who was point man on Ukraine for the Obama administration and obviously had different family ties through Hunter to the Ukrainian economy, although I'll set that aside for the moment because I don't even think it matters entirely in this context, because I think Joe Biden would be utterly committed to Ukraine and to Zelensky and to their sort of goal to remain as a bulwark against Putinism as they see it, no matter what. And there is the reading of this as a seismic shift that I genuinely wonder about because, for example, Jake Sullivan, Joe Biden, and Tony Blinken are still running policy.
And it's rare that a diplomat can become so influential that she becomes kind of like a figure and a power center in her own right. And Nuland did that with regard to Ukraine, Europe, and Russia. Brett McGurk is getting there. When it comes to kind of Mideast policy. We'll see if he survives this particular moment. Don Liu, a State Department official in South Asia, if he has another 5-10 years as he's been doing there ineffectively, but effectively for American imperial interests, he could rise to the level of a Nuland, but she is kind of in a league of her own, and in something that does not bode necessarily well for Ukrainians who are hoping that the American policy is going to stay the course. Put up this next element here. So, this is from the Associated Press. It says Nuland will be replaced temporarily as undersecretary by another career diplomat, John Bass, a former ambassador to Afghanistan who oversaw the U.S. withdrawal from the country.
Everything's fine.
Yeah, right, yes.
You're in good hands.
Right, it's like you work at a major corporation and they introduce these new consultants who are going to help us right-size the place. And they're going to be meeting with each of you for 15 minutes, and it's just going to pop up on your calendar, and don't worry about it.
Don't worry.
Yeah, it's going to be fine.
Big, the huge vibes with that comparison here. I actually want to skip ahead to our last element. This is C5 because I think this is from the All In podcast. It's David Sachs talking about Victoria Nuland, and I think this is super relevant and well put. He actually, you're going to hear him compare Nuland to being what Fauci was to COVID, to Ukraine. And his co-hosts are sort of laughing and enjoying this. And it is amusing, but I think it's amusing because it's a really good way to look at it. Let's roll C5 here.
Nuland is the Fauci of this situation, okay? The same way that Fauci was supposed to be protecting us from viruses and then funded gain-of-function research. Victoria Nuland.
Now we got a label.
Let me tell you something.
Just got labeled COVID-19 misinformation.
Victoria Nuland was supposed to be our chief diplomat with respect to Russia and Eastern Europe. And what did she do instead? She ginned up this conflict. How?
Ginned up.
We backed an insurrection in Ukraine in 2014. Jason, if you didn't like the insurrection of January 6th, let me tell you, you aren't going to like the insurrection that she staged in Ukraine because they brought in these Ukrainian far-right nationalists as the muscle. She was the State Department official who was responsible for backing this insurrection of a democratically elected leader in Ukraine in 2014 named Yanukovych, okay?
Yeah, and you know what? It's really actually pretty hard in America to talk about the Maidan uprising accurately and honestly without sounding like a lunatic.
Yes, yeah.
And so, for instance, and so we're going to play a documentary that like gets into Nuland's role and the role of John McCain and Chris Murphy in this as well. Like she showed up and started handing out basically baked goods symbolically in a gesture that was covered a lot by Western media. In the Maidan Square to show
CIA brownies.
Yeah, show U.S. support for this operation. And why I say it's very hard to talk about it honestly without sounding like a total crank is because there was a massacre in the Maidan Square that led to the far right basically taking over. There were then allegations that it was a false flag, that it was actually the far right themselves that opened fire on Maidan protesters in order to instigate this entire thing. There was then a huge internal investigation done by the subsequent Ukrainian governments, and that investigation has never been published. Like it's completed, and we just don't have it. Very serious, credible people who have looked very closely at this do not dismiss that out of hand. And the far right figures, the most far right figures who were involved in that uprising hijacked the entire thing. And with direct kind of neo-Nazi connections, went right into the government that Victoria Nuland helped to facilitate. So let's roll a little bit of the history of that moment.
And this, by the way, is from Oliver Stone's documentary, which I really recommend.
And like I said, everybody thinks Oliver Stone's a crank, but this is based on like actual history. Like these things really happened. You can hate Oliver Stone, you can think he's a crank, but this is what happened. It's
called The Ukraine on Fire. It was released in 2016. And so here he's actually talking to Viktor Yanukovych, who David Sachs obviously just mentioned.
That was intercepted. It was a call between the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt.
Questions of credibility are being raised after a private chat between two top U.S. diplomats was leaked online.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
So you had this remarkable phone call where you have these two senior officials of the U.S. government apparently talking about a coup or how they were planning to restructure the government of Ukraine.
So just a heads up, that was not the clip where he was with Yanukovych. Sorry, that was my bad. But he does extensive interviews with Yanukovych in this documentary.
Right, and just to be transparent, Yanukovych is a Russian-leaning guy.
But that's what's interesting is he seemed like he was trying to make overtures to the EU. And people remember the lobbying scheme that Paul Manafort got caught up in when he was at Mercury Public Affairs, a huge, powerful lobbying firm, and the Podesta Group, Tony Podesta ended up having to retroactively file as a registered lobbyist on behalf of Ukraine because he was representing, and again, you sound like a crank when you talk about this, but it's true, the Party of Regions, Yanukovych's party. they set up a shell think tank called the European Center for a Modern Ukraine in order to avoid registering on behalf of FARA. Now, eventually, through really great reporting by Ken Vogel and others, it came to be completely apparent that this was a shell think tank representing a political party in Ukraine, and they were trying basically to help Yanukovych get closer to the West. They were talking extensively to Hillary Clinton's State Department. You can see that in their retroactive filings. So this was all super tangled with Western interests. It's the same thing when you go down the Burisma rabbit hole and you realize how connected to sort of political power Burisma was, and then Hunter Biden was, and then Joe Biden was, just sort of by association. Western interests in Ukraine have been pushing in, making money off of Ukrainian politics in really disgusting ways. And I think one of the things, and Ryan, I'm curious, because you probably remember this, covering this when it happened with Maidan and when the Nuland phone call came out, is people were shocked, although they shouldn't have been, by her tone of voice, where she's just looking at Ukraine and Donbass like a chessboard.
Right. And because our media sucks, like the thing that made a ton of news out of that call, which presumably was intercepted by Russia, by the way, and then leaked, was when she said "F the EU." It's like, do we want to go to who do we want to go to? EOC, EU, and she's like "F the EU," and because she said it like that and said that, that became the big piece of news out of it. And the German chancellor said, how dare she say that? Like, the EU. Actually, legitimately, how dare she say that? Like, the EU has ought to have much more say over what's going on with regard to Ukraine than the United States would. Never, setting aside the idea that either of them should be dictating kind of who runs Ukraine, but I think that the Biden, the Hunter Biden, the Burisma, the lobbying, the Manafort stuff, I think that's all interesting, but I also think it's peripheral because when you have these kind of global power struggles, you've got on the one hand the kind of foundational chess playing between major powers that are driven by geopolitics between kind of the EU, the United States, and Russia. You've got those main forces. Then you've got parasites that just kind of feed off of the host that is this thing. You've got people like Manafort, none of them care.
Yes.
Hunter Biden, they don't care. They're just like, oh, there's a clash of interests here. Anytime there's a clash of interests, there's going to be money that's moving around, and we're going to try to make some of that money. And so you can think whatever you want to think about the peripheral stuff, and you can go ahead and lock all the people up as far as I'm concerned. But the actual power play, the actual geopolitics underway are what they appear to be. Like Victoria Nuland did come up with the structure of the new Ukrainian government. Like she kicked around the names. This is who we should put in. This is who should be on the outside. And that is, in fact, what ended up happening. Like that's what happened. The guy that you're talking about, Ole Tyanibuk, is basically a neo-Nazi. Like McCain met with him.
Yes.
Nuland is propping him up there.
Yes. And then they're calling everyone a Nazi here, by the way.
I said, we sound crazy, but no. Just Google this. Just Google this guy.
Yeah.
It's a hard right neo-Nazi party that we kind of pushed into power, and then Russia responded immediately by that quiet little green men thing where they sent in all these folks into Crimea, and they just popped up, and they're like, Crimea is ours now.
Yes.
And the new far right government was hyper nationalist, and the eastern Ukraine was more Yanukovych country and more Russian speaking. This new far right government came in and effectively banned speaking Russian in public, and a war breaks out in the Donbass in the eastern Ukraine region.
Yeah.
And 10 years later, here we are. So we go back to that guy's original point. Even if you take her at her own goals,
peace.
Her goal, you can agree or disagree with it. You can think it's cynical. You can think it's evil. You can think it's imperialism. It also didn't work.
Nope.
She lost. She's losing.
That's why I loved the Fauci comparison, because it's like him saying our goal is to enhance the pathogens to protect us from the pathogens.
Right, stop pandemics.
Yeah, exactly. So his goal was public health. Her goal was peace. And by those very standards, absolutely
He certainly didn't stop the pandemic. That's the funny thing. Even if you believe that it did not come out of the lab in Wuhan, the lab in Wuhan's goal was to detect a pandemic before it goes global.
Well done.
And either way, it started either in the lab or within a couple miles of the lab, and they didn't stop it. So
just great work all around, everyone.
Good work all around.
Yanukovych did end up fleeing to take shelter in Russia after a scuttled EU deal, basically.
And a lot of people thought that when Putin came back to Kyiv, he was going to try to put Yanukovych or somebody like him back on top of a puppet government.
And then again, it's this argument about Victoria Nuland by her own standards, and so often with U.S. policy, still treating everything like it's the Cold War, but even during the Cold War, you end up pushing people who may have been amenable to making deals with the EU further into the hands of Putin, which was not your goal, but counterintuitively to you, but intuitively to everyone else, is like very obviously going to be the outcome sometimes. I do have one question before we wrap to you, Ryan.
We also got to talk about her husband before we wrap, but go ahead.
Yes. My question was going to be, actually, this is perfect. My question was going to be, the CIA report in the New York Times comes out last week about the sort of deep, long-standing CIA operations in Ukraine, which we knew about from other reporting, but I think this was very clearly a coordinated leak by people in the intelligence community to get the New York Times to report that the American intelligence community had been trying to steer the Ukrainian intelligence in the right direction over all these years, but Ukrainian intelligence just kept going rogue and doing their own thing. It sort of felt like a cover your ass leak. And then the next week, Victoria Nuland is gone. I'm not tying those together in any conspiratorial way. I'm just genuinely curious what you think, Ryan, if Victoria Nuland is leaving because she lost clout, because her argument started to look more obviously like it had failed. But then at the same time, that brings us back to Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Joe Biden himself.
I mean, I would assume that she stepped aside in protest of her own, policy objectives, no longer carrying the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I would guess that whatever she was arguing for is no longer the thing that's going to happen. This is not the type of person whose will to power just has them stepping away at any key moments.
Right. That's true.
So that's my suspicion, and that's why universally people who watch this are saying this is likely to signal a significant strategic shift regarding American policy in Ukraine.
Now, let's talk about the
husband. Robert Kaplan.
That's a Real Housewives quote, by the way. You should know.
Oh, yeah.
Should we talk about the husband? It's the 9-year anniversary of the Amsterdam dinner from the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, by the way. We didn't even celebrate it.
We should talk about the husband.
Let's talk about the husband.
Real Housewives of Foggy Bottom. Robert Kaplan is one of the leading kind of neocons. And she, too, has been in the neocon circle. So if this was like one of these marriages where the people are, have divergent politics, then who cares who she's married to? But like her politics and Robert Kaplan's politics pretty clearly overlap. Now, we don't have as much public writing, from Nuland because she's been an internal operator, basically her entire career. But we do have it from Robert Kaplan, who was co-founder basically of the neoconservative movement in the 1990s that orchestrated the invasion of Iraq and the rest of that disastrous kind of American, aggressively imperial policy, rather than the kind of Nuland attempts to do imperialism, which is color revolutions and manipulating behind the scenes, but both towards the same end, spreading democracy. Working great.
Yeah, it's just synergy. Just across the board. I actually like the Real Housewives of Foggy Bottom reference because it's basically how this is operating. I don't mean that in like a sexist way, because obviously Victoria Nuland is not a housewife, and that's sort of the joke of the housewives themselves.
No, she's the brains of that family.
I mean, but it's just how DC works. That's the swamp for you in a nutshell. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.